Snow drifted over Winter's Hollow like scattered ash from some ancient hearth, softening the world into quiet shapes as the funeral procession wound its way toward the chapel. The cold carried a gentleness that felt deceptive, as if winter itself were trying to comfort the grieving. Marshal Elias Crowheart walked beside the others with his collar high against the wind. But it was not the cold that stiffened his posture. It was the sound of Ash, the police dog, pulling anxiously at his leash. The shepherd's breaths came out in frantic clouds, each one trembling in the air before vanishing into silence. Elias tried to steady him. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though the words held no conviction. Ash wasn't responding to the winter, nor the slow march of mourners. He was listening to something else, something Elias could not hear. The dog's ears twitched with the precision of a creature attuned to the smallest fracture in the world's stillness. Ahead, Seraphine Vale walked alone, her black shawl stirring in the wind like a fragile wing. She held herself as if her bones were made of frost-solid, silent, always moments from shattering. Her daughter, little Lyra, lay within the small white casket, being carried toward its resting place. People kept their distance from Seraphine, not out of cruelty perhaps, but out of that fearful curiosity that small towns cradle like a sacred ritual. She was the kind of woman they whispered about, the kind whose soft voice and solitary life invited explanations built from suspicion rather than truth. Ash released a low whine that made the hairs on Ilias's neck rise. The dog strained again, his muscles taut as ropes. Elias knelt, bringing his face close to Ash's. The shepherd's eyes, storm gray with flecks of winter in them, flickered toward the casket. It was not the ordinary look of a dog sensing grief or reacting to the tension of a crowd. It was sharper, urgent, almost pleading. Elias swallowed hard. This feeling, the sense of something just at the edge of knowing, had visited him before. Years ago, when he'd lost his own daughter, he had sensed a shift in the air moments before receiving the news. That memory clung to him even now. It's an old wound that had learned to whisper rather than scream. The procession slowed as everyone gathered around the open grave. Snow clung to eyelashes and coat shoulders, but melted on the warm faces of those quietly weeping. The undertaker, Juniper Wren, guided the casket forward, her hands gentle, her breath steady. She glanced at Ash with a crease of unease knitting her brow. "Marshal," she murmured softly, "is he always like this?" "No," Elias answered. The word felt heavy. Ash let out a bark so piercing and sudden that even the shovels halted in midair. He lunged again, twisting the leash painfully in Elias's grip. The dog's paws dug at the earth, claws scraping the thin crust of snow. Desperate to reach the casket before it descended, a murmuring wave passed through the crowd. Seraphine turned, her pale eyes widening, not in fear, but in recognition. "He hears her," she whispered, her voice breaking like a brittle twig. He always did. Elias felt the cold bite deeper through his coat. He wasn't a man ruled by superstition, yet something about her words landed with a quiet force. He watched Ash's frantic dance of urgency, the way the dog pressed his nose repeatedly toward the casket's edge. Crying as if calling to someone inside, Sheriff Bramhalder stepped forward, his boots crunching through the snow. "It's grief, Seraphine," he said firmly, though there was a tremor in his tone. "Dogs sense sorrow. That's all this is." But Ash barked again, louder this time, sharp, insistent. Echoing off the gravestones, as though the cemetery itself were shouting back, Juniper hesitated before lowering the casket. Her hands shook just slightly. "Dogs don't mourn like that," she whispered under her breath, almost too softly for anyone to hear. Seraphine covered her mouth, her breath trembling. Elias saw the flicker in her eyes, the fragile hope of a mother fighting a truth too cruel to question. "I told them," she whispered. "I told everyone she wasn't gone. Not really gone. She sleeps deep. She always has." Elias felt the shift inside himself, then a tremor of recognition, the kind that sifts through memory and present with equal weight. He stepped closer to Seraphine without thinking, letting his presence be a quiet anchor. The wind swirled around them like an unseen hand, stirring her shawl and his coat in the same breath. "You said she had?" "Spells," he murmured. "Long, quiet spells." Since she was little, she'd slip into them for hours. Once, nearly a day, people said I was imagining it. Said I kept her too close, saw things that weren't there. Her voice trembled, not from cold, but from shame, the kind that grows when others decide your grief, which makes you strange. Ash whined again. Lowering himself to the ground, Paws stretched toward the casket, as if he were begging someone to understand. Juniper cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. If we wait, if we stop now, the town will tear me apart for doubting. It's winter, Bram muttered. Bodies cool fast. Sometimes they twitch. Dogs react. Elias watched the sheriff's face. Saw the conflict there, a man trying to protect order while ignoring the weight of something he couldn't explain. The casket lowered an inch. Ash howled long. Mournful, breaking the stillness like a glass fracturing under pressure, Seraphine fell to her knees. Sobbing into her hands, Elias went to her instantly, steadying her shoulders as gently as the snowfall. She leaned into him without meaning to, her body trembling beneath the thin shawl. In that closeness, Elias felt it, the faintest pulse of warmth not from her, but from the air around them, as if the earth resisted closing over something still alive. He tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to him like frost. Juniper swallowed hard. Do we continue? Every eye turned to Elias Marshall, grieving father, the one man in town whose judgment was both respected and feared. He felt the weight of it press against his ribs. His gaze drifted to the casket, then to Ash, then to Seraphine's pale, shaking form. The winter air bit through his lungs as he exhaled slowly. Lower it gently, he finally said, voice restrained, though doubt whispered through him like wind through bare branches. Let's give her the peace she deserves. Seraphine choked back a sob, but did not argue. She pulled away from Elias, though her fingers trembled as if reluctant to release the warmth his hands offered. The casket descended inch by inch, snowflakes landing on the wood like tiny, fleeting blessings. Ash's cries softened into broken whimpers, then into a hollow silence that struck Elias harder than the barking had. When it was done, the earth seemed to sigh. People drifted away in clusters, their whispers curling into the air like smoke. Strange woman, poor girl, the dogs just confused. Elias walked Seraphine home through the gentle storm. The snow muffled their footsteps, turning the night into something soft and intimate. She said little, but every few breaths her voice cracked with a sound like a quiet apology. To whom, Elias could not tell. When they reached her small cabin, she paused at the door. Thank you, she murmured, though the words felt too small for the grief in her voice. Her hand brushed his sleeve for a heartbeat. A gesture, not a declaration. A slow, fragile connection taking its first breath. Ash stayed behind at the cemetery, refusing to budge, sitting sentinel beside the fresh mound of earth. Elias watched him from afar, a dark shape against the pale snow. And something inside him twisted again, an ache deeper than sorrow and sharper than fear. Later that night, sleep dodged Elias like a wary animal. As he lay in the dim quiet of his home, a faint sound touched the edge of his awareness. So soft he thought it was a memory at first, a tapping. Light, rhythmic, persistent. He sat up, heart knocking against his sternum. The sound faded into the winter wind. Snow pressed against his window, insistent like knuckles, rapping on thin glass, and Elias found himself whispering into the darkness, unsure whether he meant the wind, the memory of his daughter, or something deeper buried beneath the cold earth. Sometimes, winter knocks twice, though nothing more happened that night. The air felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting. And Elias, despite the exhaustion pressing on him, could not shake the feeling that the story was not finished, not by grief, nor by doubt, nor even by death. Something was still moving beneath the winter, something that refused to be buried. Ash slipped into the night like a shadow with purpose, his paws barely whispering against the snow as he vanished beyond the lamplight. Elias noticed the empty leash by the door before dawn had fully bloomed, the cold air sharp as a blade against his lungs as he stepped outside. The world was still, carrying that particular silence winter grants before it reveals something unbearable. He followed the faint prints pressed into the frost, each one a heartbeat, leading him toward an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. The sky carried an early morning glow. When Elias reached the cemetery, Ash was there, a dark sentinel against the pale drift of snow, staring fixedly at the earth above Lyra's grave. He did not bark this time. He did not cry. He only stood rigid, tail low, ears locked forward as if listening to the deepest breath of the ground. Elias approached carefully, placing a hand on the dog's back. Ash trembled not with cold, but with anticipation. His nose pressed into the snow, and he made a small circle in the ground. The way he did when he knew something still breathed. Elias knelt, pressing his own ear closer. The wind hissed past the headstones, carrying nothing but emptiness. Yet beneath that thin veil of sound he sensed a pattern, soft, fractional, impossibly light. A tapping, hesitant but real, like a child trying not to wake the dark. His breath caught. Disbelief and terror tangled in his chest. He rose quickly, lantern swinging in his grip as he sprinted toward town. Sheriff Bram opened his door at the first frantic knock, bleary-eyed but alert once he saw Elias's face. No questions. Just boots pulled on in silence, a coat grabbed. And the two men ran into the dim winter morning, Ash leading with fierce certainty. Their breath fogged in heavy bursts, the urgency between them needing no words. Seraphine's cabin stood dark. But the moment Elias pounded on the door, a light flared inside, and she pulled it open with trembling hands. Her hair was unbound, her eyes swollen from a night spent fighting dreams too heavy to speak. When Elias told her what he'd heard, her knees nearly buckled. Bram caught her arm, steadying her as she covered her mouth to choke back a sound that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. They moved together toward the cemetery as the sky brightened, the pale dawn light stretching across the snow like a veil pulling back from the truth. Ash raced ahead, circling the grave with frantic devotion. Seraphine fell to her knees the moment she reached it, her palms pressed to the earth as if she could warm the frozen soil through sheer longing. "Lyra," she whispered. The wind seemed to pause. Bram didn't wait for further confirmation. He grabbed the shovel left, propped against the fence, and began to dig with a force fueled by both dread and repentance. Elias joined him, each strike of metal against frozen ground echoing in his bones. The earth fought them, stiff with winter. But they carved it away piece by desperate piece. Seraphine remained close, her hands brushing the soil as if encouraging it to surrender her child. She murmured old lullabies under her breath, soft, wavering notes that seemed to weave themselves into the cold morning air. Elias caught fragments of the tune, felt them pull at something gentle inside him. Something he'd forgotten how to hold, at last. The casket surface came into view, white wood now, dirt-stained and cold, but not lifeless. The tapping came again, faint but undeniable. Bram dropped to his knees, his breath shuddering through him. "God forgive us," he whispered. Elias leaned close. "Lyra, can you hear us?" A muffled sound, a soft, trembling crippled from within. Seraphine covered her heart with both hands as it threatened to burst through her chest. They pried the lid open with numbed fingers, wood cracking under the pressure. When the hinges finally gave way, a small gasp rose from the casket, sharp, fragile, sacred. Lyra lay curled inside, her skin pale but warm, her lashes fluttering like wings, uncertain of flight. She blinked into the dawn with the dazed innocence of someone waking from a dream. Too deep for words, Seraphine reached in with a cry that seemed to shake the sky itself. She held her daughter to her chest, rocking gently, weeping into her hair. Lyra clung weakly to her, tiny fingers grasping at familiar fabric. Elias felt his throat burn as he watched them. Grief and relief twisted into something luminous. Ash pressed his muzzle to Lyra's feet. A low whine reverberating from his chest, half apology, half joy. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched the dog's fur. "I called," she whispered. "He heard me." Seraphine closed her eyes, shaking with emotion. "Of course he did, my love. Of course he did." Yet even in the beauty of the moment, something darker stirred beneath Lyra's words. Elias leaned closer, sensing the shift in her breath. "Lyra," he said softly, "can you tell us what happened before you slept?" Her small brow furrowed, a shadow sweeping across her expression. "I had my nighttime tea," she whispered, "but it tasted strange. And then my chest felt heavy. I tried to call for Mama. I tried." Her voice trembled. Ash was the only one who heard. Seraphine's face tightened, a tremor of fear and fury crossing her features. Bram's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. There wasn't room yet for accusation. Only protection. Only truth. Elias placed a steadying hand on Seraphine's shoulder. Her grief-stricken strength softened beneath his touch. And for a moment she leaned into him, drawing courage from his quiet presence. Not a declaration, not a promise, just the silent weaving of two lives newly tethered by a second chance, as they carried Lyra from the graveyard. People began to gather at the edge of the path. Whispers rose like cold mist, astonishment, fear, shame. The town of Winter's Hollow had never been kind to Seraphine, but now every gaze was a mirror reflecting regret. Seraphine held Lyra tighter, her spine straightening as if warmth had returned to places grief once hollowed out. For the first time, she lifted her chin in the face of their stares. Her eyes shone not with defiance, but with unwavering love. Elias walked beside her, not as a savior, but as someone who had chosen, quietly and irrevocably, to stand with her. The route back felt longer, gentler. Threaded with the fragile beginnings of understanding, Ash trotted at their side, glancing often at Lyra, as if ensuring she still breathed the same air he did. By the time they reached Seraphine's cabin, the morning light had grown gold around the edges of the world. Lyra was wrapped in Ilias's coat, her tiny face resting against her mother's shoulder, her breaths slow but steady. Sheriff Brom's voice lowered as he said he would investigate. But the truest climax of the morning had already passed, not the threat of danger, but the saving of a life the town was ready to bury. The deeper villain, whoever they were, remained unnamed. Winter would reveal that truth in time, as it always did. Inside the cabin, Seraphine settled Lyra beside the fire. Elias lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave her to the private miracle of regaining her child. But Seraphine reached out, fingers brushing his sleeve, gentle, hesitant, full of unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Not the hollow gratitude of obligation, but the trembling sincerity of someone who had been pulled back from despair's edge. Elias swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. Ash heard her. "I only followed." But she shook her head, eyes softening. "No, you listened. That mattered more than you know." Ash lay at Lyra's feet, sighing deeply, as if finally allowing himself rest. Elias felt a quiet warmth fill the room, wrapping around them with the softness of thawing frost. Something in him, something long locked away, shifted slightly, letting in light he hadn't dared to seek. Later, as he stepped back into the cold air, Elias paused beside the path. The sunrise touched the snow in hues of pale rose and gold, and the world seemed newly awake. He breathed it in slowly, letting it settle into the hollow spaces of his chest. In years to come, he would recall this moment as the winter that taught him the simplest truth: that sometimes salvation arrives not through might or miracles, but through the quiet courage of listening, truly listening to the faintest, like sound beneath the weight of the world. And if the reader were standing beside him now, he might turn and offer this: may you never ignore a whisper simply because it sounds small. Sometimes the smallest sound is the one that saves a life. For more whispered tales of courage, kindness, and hope, don't forget to subscribe.